Imagine waking up one morning and stepping outside, expecting the familiar warmth of the sun on your face, only to find the world shrouded in a dim blue twilight. The light is so weak that you can barely see your own hand in front of you. Birds are silent. Animals act restless. The air carries a strange chill, as if the seasons themselves have been paused. For 18 months, this is all there is, no explanation, no warning, no comfort. Welcome to the year 536 CE, often called the worst year to be alive in human history. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lunar History. If you love diving into history's most mysterious and dramatic events, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, so you won't miss any of our deep dives into the past. And don't forget to ring the notification bell. That's the best way to stay updated when we uncover history's hidden stories. So why was 536 so catastrophic? Imagine a fog that isn't a normal cloud or a passing storm, but a thick, persistent haze that drifts over Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. The sun struggles to pierce it, casting a cold, unnatural light over everything. Crops begin to fail, rivers freeze at unusual times, and famine quietly spreads from village to village. People who lived through it had no frame of reference. They didn't know if this darkness was a punishment, warning, or just the way the world had suddenly decided to be. Life became a daily struggle. Families huddled together for warmth, rationing food and resources, while uncertainty gnawed at every decision. Cities became magnets for those desperate to survive, but crowded streets brought their own dangers, disease, theft, and a constant worry that the next meal might not come. Even those with skills, like farmers and bakers, had to reinvent their work to survive under a sun that barely shone. And yet, amidst this chaos, human resilience shines through. People adapted in creative ways, growing mushrooms indoors to bypass the need for sunlight, sharing limited food with neighbors, and forming small communities bound by mutual support. Even children, who might have seemed powerless in such a crisis, found ways to help, to learn, and to protect one another. Their survival wasn't just about endurance, it was about ingenuity, hope, and the strength of family and community. In this video, we're going to explore the story of 536 CE like never before. We'll step into the shoes of those who lived through the darkness, follow their journeys to cities and farms, and uncover the ways in which they survived one of the harshest periods in human history. Along the way, we'll highlight real-life examples of courage, resilience, and creativity that are as inspiring today as they were 1,500 years ago. So stay tuned, because by the end of this video, you'll not only understand why 536 was so devastating, but you'll also discover the timeless lessons about human perseverance, community, and hope that we can carry into our own lives today. If you're ready, let us step into the darkness together and see how people found light when the sun itself seemed to disappear. As we step further into this tale, imagine yourself living in a small village somewhere in Europe, surrounded by fields that once promised life and sustenance, yet now lie under a mysterious gloom so thick it almost feels alive, pressing down upon the earth and settling into every corner of your home, your mind, your very bones. The year is 536 CE, and what you are witnessing is not just an ordinary hardship or the slow, familiar struggle of seasons gone awry, but an event so extraordinary and devastating that historians have later labeled it the worst year to be alive in human history. For those who lived through it, it was as though the very balance of the world had been overturned, as if the sky itself had conspired against humanity, robbing the sun of its brilliance and leaving the earth in a twilight that blurred the boundaries between day and night, summer and winter, life and despair. Imagine stepping outside each morning to a world that should be awakening with warmth and promise, yet finding only a dim blue light, strange and unnatural, filtering through a veil of fog that seems endless, its presence so pervasive that even familiar landmarks, the church steeple, the river bend, the grove of trees, Near the village edge take on a ghostly, alien quality, distorted in shadow and half-light. Crops that should be sprouting and ripening under the nurturing rays of the sun struggle to grow, their leaves curling and browning as frost appears unexpectedly in March, stubborn and cruel. And even the animals seem to sense the disruption, moving nervously, refusing their usual routines, and sending a quiet, primal warning to anyone who would notice that something is deeply wrong. It is a time when knowledge offers no comfort, for no one knows why this darkness has descended. No one can predict when it will end, and the collective human imagination fills the gap with fear, superstition, and whispers of divine punishment. As each passing day stretches into the next with no reprieve, spell itself becomes an ever-present uncertainty that hangs over every action, from tending the fields to securing a meal, from comforting a frightened child to questioning the very order of the universe. As you try to make sense of this new reality, you might walk through the village streets and notice the strain etched on the faces of neighbors, once lively and confident, now gaunt and weary, their eyes reflecting the exhaustion of constant vigilance against hunger, cold, and the invisible threats that lurk in a world where the natural rhythms have been upended. Even those tasked with leadership, the village head, the elders, or distant authorities, offer little guidance. But they too are grappling with an unprecedented crisis in the usual sources of stability. Whether tradition, faith, or community structures seem fragile and insufficient against the sheer weight of this prolonged catastrophe. It is in these moments, however, that human resilience begins to show its quiet strength. As families band together, children learn new skills, and communities discover unexpected ways to adapt, improvising with what little they have, nurturing hope amidst despair, and finding small victories in the survival of each day, no matter how dim the light may be. In this story, 536 CE is more than a date on a page of history. It is an immersive journey into the lived experience of people confronting the unimaginable, forcing us to consider what life would feel like if the sun itself seemed to betray us, and teaching us that even in the darkest periods, human courage, ingenuity, and connection can illuminate paths to survival and, eventually, recovery. As the year 536 unfolded, the world seemed to tilt into an entirely new and unrecognizable reality for what descended upon Europe, the Middle East, and vast stretches of Asia was not a storm, nor a passing cloud, nor any weather the people of that era had ever known, but a mysterious, almost tangible fog that wrapped the continents in a pall of muted blue light, so persistent and unyielding that it seemed as if the sun itself had been stolen from the sky, leaving behind a dim twilight that stretched endlessly across days, weeks, and months, and that would linger for 18 long, unrelenting months. Imagine waking each morning expecting the familiar warmth of sunlight on your face, only to be greeted by a sky that appears perpetually bruised, where the horizon is swallowed by a murky haze and the very air carries a cold, damp heaviness that seeps into your clothes, to your hair, and your bones, making each step outside a cautious venture into a world that feels both foreign and hostile, where the familiar landmarks of your village or town once full of comforting detail and color are reduced to shadowy outlines, ghostly and distorted in the muted light, and even the simplest acts, like tending animals, fetching water, or walking to the marketplace, are shadowed by a quiet, unsettling tension, as if every living creature, human and animal alike, senses that something is profoundly wrong. The fog did not behave like ordinary weather, shifting and passing with the hours or days. Instead, it seemed eternal, almost sentient, lingering stubbornly over mountains, rivers, and fields, diffusing the sun's warmth and light until even noon feels like the dim hour before twilight. And every morning, every evening, and every fleeting hour of daylight carries the same strange, spectral blue glow, casting a dreamlike, otherworldly filter over the familiar rhythms of life. Crops began to falter in ways the farmers could hardly comprehend, their seeds failing to germinate properly, their shoots curling under the persistent chill. While fruit trees seemed trapped in suspended animation, their buds hesitant or entirely absent. And frost began appearing in months when it should have long vanished, marking a world where the seasons themselves had been thrown into confusion, leaving hunger, fear, and uncertainty to seep into the lives of every family struggling to survive. Communities, once bound by routine, found themselves forced into improvisation. Neighbors banded together, sharing what little food remained, offering shelter to the most vulnerable, and cautiously venturing beyond their homes to search for water, firewood, or work, while whispered speculations filled the air, ranging from the terrifying to the mystical, as people tried to explain a phenomenon that defied all understanding, from celestial punishment to a world simply gone awry. No one could know when the fog would lift, whether it would lift at all, or what the consequences would be for those who survived. And with each passing week, the shadow of the unknown grew heavier, pressing on hearts and minds alike, shaping the course of life in ways both immediate and unimaginable, creating a period where survival demanded not only resilience and ingenuity, but also a courage to face the world each day without any assurance that lighter, even safety would return. It was in this relentless haze that humanity's quiet, stubborn determination became most visible as families, villages, and eventually cities adapted to a world where the sun seemed absent, learning to navigate the dim, cold landscape, to ration food with precision, and to hold fast to hope even as the fog stretched on, relentless and omnipresent, transforming the familiar into the unrecognizable, and turning the very act of living into an extraordinary testament to human endurance in the face of a world that had, for a time, lost its light. Amid this unrelenting twilight, the people of 536 found themselves trapped in a reality that defied explanation, their minds struggling to grasp a phenomenon for which they had no precedent, no guide, and no reassurance, leaving them suspended between disbelief and mounting dread, as each day's dim light reinforced the unsettling truth that something extraordinary and deeply threatening had taken hold of their world, something that neither prayer, ritual, nor counsel could dispel. Villagers huddled around hearths, clutching their children and whispering theories that ranged from celestial punishment for sins, omens of an approaching apocalypse, or the wrath of capricious deities, their hearts heavy with the uncertainty of not knowing whether this darkness was temporary or eternal, whether it heralded famine, disease, or death, or whether their meager efforts to survive even mattered in a universe that seemed suddenly indifferent to human suffering. Families who had once moved through their routines with confidence plowing fields, tending livestock, preparing meals now found themselves paralyzed by indecision, each task transformed into a perilous undertaking in a world where the familiar cues of day, season, and weather had been rendered unreliable, and where the simplest mistakes could mean losing precious food, exposure to cold, or the spread of illness. Children tugged anxiously at the hands of their parents, seeking reassurance that could not be given, while adults exchanged silent glances that betrayed their growing helplessness, knowing instinctively that the skills and knowledge which had guided their ancestors were no longer sufficient to navigate a reality so profoundly altered. Markets and trade networks slowed, as farmers with failed crops hesitated to travel to sell their goods, and merchants, uncertain of supply routes, feared moving through lands now shrouded in unending gloom. Even the animals, those silent witnesses to the upheaval, behaved erratically, their instincts alerting humans to the subtle changes in air and temperature that foreshadowed the coming hardships. Yet no one could interpret these signs with certainty, leaving families to rely on a fragile mixture of intuition, hope, and desperate trial and error in order to survive. The collective anxiety manifested in every corner of life, shaping decisions large and small, from rationing food and prioritizing the sick to determining whether a journey to the nearest city was worth the risk, or whether the only course was to hunker down and hope the world would return to normal on its own. Communities, once confident in their local knowledge and established hierarchies, discovered that their leaders were just as confused and unprepared, scrambling to coordinate relief, ration resources, and maintain order, yet frequently failing in the face of a problem that transcended human comprehension. Stories circulated of entire villages losing their harvests, families succumbing to cold and hunger, and neighbors vanishing seemingly overnight, leaving behind empty homes and the haunting question of where they had gone. And in every whispered tale, the uncertainty remained. Why was this happening? Who or what was responsible? And how long would it last? In the midst of this fear and confusion, the most remarkable aspect of humanity emerged, not the despair that the darkness inspired, but the way people adapted to it, forging new routines, supporting one another, and discovering resilience that could survive even in the absence of clarity. Guidance or hope for immediate relief, learning day by day to endure, to observe, and to live in a world that had, for the first time, taught them that survival was as much a test of courage and ingenuity as it was of physical strength or resourcefulness. As the months wore on, the cold settled into every home and field, creeping beneath thatched roofs, through gaps in walls, and into the hearts of families who had once taken comfort in the predictable rhythms of life, leaving them to contend with a reality where survival became an endless negotiation with the elements, the land, and their own growing fear. Farmers rose each day to inspect crops that refused to flourish, their hands raw and chapped from digging through soil that was stubborn, frozen in patches, or turned to mud in others, a patchwork of struggle that mocked their knowledge and experience, as seeds either failed to sprout or produced only stunted, sickly shoots that could barely sustain the family through even a single week. Mothers, whose daily routines had once revolved around tending hearth and children, now found themselves rationing every scrap of food, cutting back their own portions so that their children might have bread or a thin soup, while fathers attempted the impossible task of tending animals that shivered in the unnatural chill, their usual strength and skill challenged by a sunless sky, and frosts that appeared when spring should have brought warmth and growth. Children learned, sometimes before they were ready, the weight of responsibility, helping carry firewood from distant forests, fetching water from creeks whose currents had slowed or partially frozen, and keeping watch over younger siblings as their parents labored for hours in fields that promised little harvest. Even play became a careful negotiation with survival. Games in the streets were cut short by sudden chills, and the laughter of youth was tempered by the anxious knowledge that every day carried the risk of hunger, sickness, or the simple misery of a world turned strange and hostile. Meals became rituals of rationing, with families gathering around the smallest fires to make what little they could from roots, dried grains, and occasionally preserved vegetables, whispering prayers over their meager portions and marveling at the small victories of having enough for a single day. Villages themselves felt the strain collectively. Grain stores dwindled, and neighbors who had once shared freely became cautious and wary, mindful that scarcity could turn kindness into vulnerability. Paths between homes grew treacherous in frost-laden mornings, and the smoke from fires mingled with the fog, creating a haze that seemed to stretch endlessly across the landscape, so that the familiar lines of fields, fences, and forests blurred into a single, indistinct mass. The air was thick, not only with cold, but with tension, for the unknown threat of famine was compounded by the uncertainty of how long it would last, leaving families to weigh every decision: when to plant, when to eat, when to risk leaving the village to barter for essential supplies with a seriousness and calculation that no child or adult could have imagined in the sunlit years before. Yet amidst the relentless struggle, human adaptability began to emerge in quiet, extraordinary ways. Families discovered that certain roots could be roasted to sustain them, that small patches of sunlight, even the faintest streaks, could nurture seedlings in sheltered corners, and that cooperation with the neighbors offered a lifeline, as skills were shared, tools exchanged, and knowledge pooled to squeeze sustenance from a world that had seemingly turned against them. In these small acts of ingenuity and resilience, the human spirit revealed its capacity to endure, to adapt, and to cling to hope, even in a time when light itself seemed to have abandoned the earth, teaching lessons in perseverance and community that would echo far beyond the dim, cold months of the year 536, shaping the very way those who survived understood the fragility and the value of life itself. As the unnatural twilight stretched on, the arrival of frost in months when warmth should have been returning added a cruel twist to the daily struggle for survival, transforming fields that once promised abundance into landscapes of disappointment and loss, where the tender shoots of wheat, barley, and vegetables shriveled under the icy fingers of a spring that refused to bloom, leaving farmers to stare helplessly at soil that seemed to mock their every effort, while the air itself carried a biting chill that gnawed through the simplest of clothing and made every trip outside a trial against both cold and exhaustion. Families watched in despair as their hard work yielded little to nothing, and the scarcity of food soon became painfully apparent, forcing mothers to carefully divide meager portions among children, fathers to supplement diets with whatever wild roots or foraged plants could be coaxed from the frozen earth, and even the youngest members of households to learn, almost instinctively, how to conserve energy and ration the little nourishment that could be secured from day to day. The effects on the human body were immediate and visible. Once robust villagers began to lose weight, their faces hollowed and their strength diminished, a tangible reflection of the scarcity that had invaded every home. Children, whose growth and energy depend on consistent nutrition, struggled to maintain the vitality of their youth, while adults found their labor increasingly arduous, muscles weakened by insufficient sustenance, and minds preoccupied by the constant calculation of what to eat, when to eat, and how to make it last. Even simple tasks, like carrying water or tending to animals, became acts of extraordinary effort, and the ever-present fear of running out of food compounded the psychological burden, as families realized that their survival depended not just on skill or endurance, but on the unpredictable mercy of a world that seemed determined to deny them the basics of life. Markets, too, reflected the crisis, as grain prices soared and the shelves of city stalls emptied quickly under the pressure of widespread famine, turning ordinary exchanges into desperate negotiations where every loaf of bread or portion of cheese became a precious commodity, and where neighbors who might have once helped one another now approached with caution, mindful that sharing today could mean going hungry tomorrow. Hunger became both the physical and social condition, reshaping relationships, behaviors, and even moral choices, as communities struggled to balance generosity with survival, and as the weak, the sick, and the elderly faced an unspoken risk that their vulnerability might tip the scales of who lived and who suffered most severely. Yet, even in this harsh reality, moments of ingenuity and adaptation appeared, small but significant victories against the omnipresent threat of starvation. Families learned to preserve what little food they had through drying, fermenting, or storing it in creative ways. Children discovered edible wild plants that could supplement their meager diets, and communities shared knowledge of hidden springs, sheltered gardens, or even underground cellars where frost could be kept at bay long enough to salvage what crops remained. These acts of quiet ingenuity, born from necessity, illuminated the resilience of the human spirit, demonstrating that even when the sun itself seemed to abandon the world, people could still find ways to endure, to support one another, and to cling to hope that life, in some form, would persist despite the relentless shadows of the frost-laden months. As the frost persisted and the meager harvests continued to fail, whispers began to spread through villages of distant cities where hope, or at least the promise of sustenance, might still exist. And families who had once clung to the familiarity of home began the difficult and dangerous decision to leave everything they had known behind and set out toward places like Constantinople, a city that loomed as a beacon of civilization and relative abundance. Amid a world increasingly hostile and unrecognizable, these journeys were never simple or safe. They were marked by treacherous roads, muddied by unseasonal rains, rivers swollen by persistent cold, and forests and plains where the unnatural silence of wildlife added a subtle, ever-present unease. Parents clutched the hands of children, guiding them through the gloom, carrying what little they could spare: small bundles of clothes, a treasured cooking pot, a few remaining coins, and moving cautiously, aware that every step carried both the hope of survival and the risk of further deprivation. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of cities overflowing with refugees, of markets under strain, and of officials who might turn travelers away. Yet the instinct to protect one's family and secure food proved stronger than fear, compelling them forward through the blue haze that had come to define their days and the cold that had begun to seep into their very bones. The roads themselves became a microcosm of the broader suffering, as groups of families banded together for safety, sharing information about where food might still be available, pooling strength to carry the elderly or infirm, and keeping watch against theft or violence that sometimes accompanied desperation. Children walked alongside their parents, some too young to understand the enormity of the world's upheaval, yet sensitive to the tension and whispered fears that colored every conversation, learning early that survival depended on vigilance, cooperation, and courage in ways that had been unimaginable in the sunlit years before the darkness descended. Along the way, strangers became allies, forming temporary communities bound by the shared pursuit of safety and sustenance. And in the quiet moments at night, as families huddled in makeshift shelters or under the shadow of ancient ruins, stories were exchanged, guidance offered, and fragile hope kindled. For even in the absence of sunlight, human connection provided warmth and reassurance that survival was still possible. Arrival in cities like Constantinople was both a relief and a new challenge, as the sheer density of people, already stressed by famine and disease, created crowded streets, limited resources, and heightened tensions. And families who had survived the journey found themselves negotiating for food, work, and shelter amid an unfamiliar urban environment. Fathers and mothers sought employment in whatever capacity they could, from laboring in bakeries to tending small gardens tucked between city walls, while children learned to assist, often in ways that contributed directly to the family's survival, whether by carrying water, helping with animals, or simply remaining vigilant and obedient in the face of a complex and sometimes frightening world. Even within this chaos, small triumphs became profound victories. A loaf of bread saved for tomorrow, a quiet corner to rest, a successful trade with a neighbor, all represented the endurance of human ingenuity and the determination to carve out life in a reality that had been fundamentally altered, proving that even when darkness and scarcity dominate the landscape, hope, resourcefulness, and the bonds of family and community can illuminate paths to survival. Upon reaching Constantinople, families who had endured long, exhausting journeys through frost-laden fields and fog-shrouded roads discovered that arrival in the city brought both relief and new challenges. For the safety and relative abundance that had drawn them there existed alongside conditions that were crowded, precarious, and often dangerous. A daily reminder that survival was never guaranteed and that hope itself was fragile in a world upended by catastrophe. The streets, once bustling with merchants and travelers, in ordinary times, now overflowed with refugees from every corner of the empire, their faces etched with exhaustion, worry, and hunger, their hands carrying the few possessions that had survived the journey, their children clinging tightly to their parents or stumbling under the weight of burdens too heavy for their small shoulders. The sheer density of people meant that shelter was scarce, often relegated to makeshift arrangements in abandoned homes, overcrowded inns, or shared quarters in larger compounds where privacy was impossible. In the mingling of so many individuals, each with their own needs, fears, and ambitions, created an atmosphere tense with both cooperation and conflict, where every interaction had the potential to bring relief or spark discord. Food remained the most pressing concern, for even in a city famed for its markets, the influx of desperate families stretched resources to the breaking point, and long lines at bakeries and granaries became a test of patience, endurance, and sometimes ingenuity, as families learned to negotiate, trade, or wait for hours in the cold and dim light of an unnatural sun, hoping that the meager rations they obtained would last long enough to stave off hunger for another day. Children, whose energy and growth depended on nutrition, were often the most visibly affected, their small bodies showing the toll of months of scarcity, their cheeks hollow, their movements slower. Yet even in these conditions, they displayed remarkable adaptability, learning quickly which foods could be eaten raw, which stores might have overlooked provisions, and which streets were safer to traverse during uncertain hours. Parents, meanwhile, balanced a desperate need to secure sustenance with the imperative to protect their children, teaching them caution without extinguishing curiosity, stilling resilience without overwhelming fear, and, in the process, forging bonds of trust and resourcefulness that would become essential for navigating the unfamiliar urban landscape. Danger lurked in every corner, from the threat of petty theft to more serious disputes over limited resources, from disease spreading rapidly through densely packed quarters to the simple unpredictability of urban life in a world already destabilized by famine and unnatural darkness. Yet, amidst these trials, the human capacity for adaptation emerged in subtle but profound ways. Families carved out small routines to maintain some semblance of normalcy, scavenged creatively from neglected stores or gardens, bartered for work in bakeries, stables, or workshops, and sought out other refugees for mutual support, forming temporary networks of protection and shared knowledge, relying on the very community that had once been fragmented by distance to provide a lifeline in this overwhelming, crowded environment. In this crucible of adversity, survival became both a physical and social endeavor, demanding not only endurance and cunning, but also empathy, cooperation, and the ability to recognize the fragile interdependence of life in a city stretched to its limits, teaching lessons that would resonate far beyond the immediate crisis, that even in the darkest, most crowded, and most uncertain conditions, the human spirit can adapt, endure, and find small victories, and that hope, though sometimes hard to grasp, remains a force capable of sustaining life when all else seems lost. In the crowded, dimly lit streets of Constantinople, where the pale, persistent haze filtered every shaft of sunlight into a muted glow, and the air seemed perpetually tinged with the chill of early frost, opportunities to earn a living were scarce and fiercely competitive. Yet, even the humblest forms of labor offered a lifeline, a way to secure sustenance in a world where food was the most precious commodity, and every meal was an achievement, hard won, testament to perseverance, resourcefulness, and human tenacity. Families who had once depended on fertile fields and familiar routines now found themselves navigating a labyrinth of city streets, seeking whatever work they could find, from stacking empty baskets in bakeries whose ovens barely kept the cold at bay, to tending small plots of land tucked into the shadows of massive stone walls, to assisting in workshops, stables, in warehouses, performing repetitive, exhausting tasks that, though menial, ensured that they would not face the direst consequences of famine. Fathers, mothers, and even older children took on these roles with a quiet determination, knowing that their labor directly translated to survival, that each hour spent caring, sorting, cleaning, pretending might bring bread for the table, cheese for a child, or a small measure of hope that the next day would be no harsher than the last. The work itself was often grueling and relentless, as the sunless sky and pervasive cold sapped strength more quickly than usual, and the psychological strain of constant vigilance watching over children, guarding possessions, and negotiating scarce resources made every task feel heavier than it might in ordinary times, Yet, there was a profound dignity in the effort, a subtle resilience born of necessity, as families adapted to the new rules of survival, developing skills and routines that allowed them to endure while preserving what remained of their humanity. Children learned early to contribute meaningfully, fetching water, carrying supplies, assisting with animals, or simply helping maintain a small patch of city garden that might yield a few edible greens. And in doing so, they became participants in the delicate balance between labor and life, understanding that the smallest contribution could tip the scale from hunger to nourishment. Even more, these modest forms of employment fostered connections that extended beyond mere survival. Relationships formed with bakers, farmers, innkeepers, and fellow refugees, creating networks of mutual aid and trust. And within these connections, families discover ways to stretch resources further, share knowledge about the city's hidden corners, or protect one another from the hazards that inevitably arose in such crowded, unpredictable conditions. Every loaf baked, every row of seedlings tended, every chore completed was both a practical necessity and a psychological anchor, a way of asserting agency in a world that had, for months, seemed determined to overwhelm with uncertainty and despair. Through labor, people reclaimed a measure of control, transformed idle fear into productive action, and, in the process, began to carve out a life that, while far removed from the sunlit fields of their past, provided sustenance, security, and a glimmer of hope that the world, even in the lingering darkness of 536, could still be navigated, survived, and, ultimately, lived. In the midst of relentless scarcity, frost-covered streets, and the oppressive blue haze that lingered day and night, families soon realized that survival depended not only on personal effort, but on the collective strength of the community. And gradually, informal networks began to form, born of necessity, trust, and the recognition that no single household could endure the trials of the darkened world alone. Neighbors who had once maintained polite distance found themselves sharing knowledge, tools, and meager food stores, trading stories of where wild roots might be foraged, which cellars offered shelter from frost, or how to coax a few stubborn seedlings to grow in the shadows of stone walls and under the faintest glimmers of sun. Children became messengers and helpers, carrying bundles between households, alerting adults to dangers, and learning, almost instinctively, the value of cooperation and loyalty, while adults discovered the subtle but profound power of shared labor, from tending communal gardens to pooling rations for those who had been weakened by hunger or illness. And in these acts, a fragile yet enduring web of support emerged, a lifeline threaded through the uncertainty that dominated every aspect of life. These small survival networks were not only practical, but deeply human, creating spaces of reassurance, conversation, and solidarity in a city where the familiar rhythms of life had been upended, and where fear and exhaustion could easily overwhelm even the strongest hearts. Families took turns watching over one another's children, sharing stoves and fires, and helping repair clothing, tools, and shelters. Each act a gesture of trust that could mean the difference between life and death. While informal leaders emerged within the networks on the eldest, the most experienced, or those who had maintained a calm presence amidst chaos, guiding decisions. mediating disputes, and providing counsel to those struggling to navigate the harsh realities of frostbitten fields and meager urban rations. Beyond the practical advantages, these networks offered a psychological anchor, a reminder that even when the world seemed indifferent and the sun itself had abandoned the skies, people were not alone, and that shared effort could create resilience, hope, and a sense of belonging that buffered against despair. The collective knowledge of the group where food could be found, how to keep children warm, which streets were safer to travel, and even which wild plants were edible became more valuable than coin or possession, turning cooperation into a currency of survival. Through trial and error, families learned to balance caution with generosity, fostering relationships that could endure scarcity without being broken by greed or fear. And in doing so, they crafted a society within the society, one in which human empathy, ingenuity, and solidarity became as essential as bread or firewood. Even in moments of quiet despair, when frost blanketed the streets and the dim light offered no comfort, these survival networks reminded families that life could be endured, and that hope, however small or flickering, was a force amplified through shared effort, whispered encouragement, and the unspoken understanding that together, could survive what the sunless world of 536 CE had thrown at them. Finding ways to adapt, to protect one another, and to sustain not just their bodies, but the fragile flame of human spirit that refused to be extinguished. No matter how long the darkness lingered, faced with unrelenting frost, failing crops, and a sun that barely pierced the thick haze, people quickly realized that survival required more than endurance. It demanded creativity, resourcefulness, and a willingness to experiment with entirely new ways of providing food for themselves and their families. And it was in this crucible of necessity that some of the most remarkable adaptations began to emerge, turning desperation into innovation and revealing the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit even in the bleakest of times. In the shadowed corners of crowded homes and cellars, families began cultivating mushrooms, recognizing that these mysterious fungi thrived in darkness and could provide a reliable source of nourishment when sunlight and fertile soil were no longer dependable allies. The process involved careful attention to humidity, temperature, and the choice of organic material, requiring a patience and ingenuity that mirrored the meticulous care once devoted to tending sunlit fields, yet now applied in an environment wholly alien, where survival demanded a combination of observation, experimentation, and faith in the results. Parents instructed children on the delicate balance of nurturing these indoor crops, turning everyday chores into lessons in science and stewardship, while neighbors exchanged tips on maximizing yield and avoiding spoilage, creating informal knowledge networks that complemented the physical survival networks already in place, and in the process, transforming desperation into a form of quiet empowerment, where each successful harvest, however modest, represented both a practical victory over hunger and a psychological affirmation that human ingenuity could still bend the forces of nature to its will, even when the natural order seemed to have been disrupted so profoundly. Beyond mushrooms, people experimented with small, sheltered gardens in courtyards, on rooftops, or within the narrow spaces between buildings, using any scraps of fertile soil they could gather, crafting rudimentary greenhouses from cloth, wood, and clay, and carefully selecting plant species that could tolerate diminished light and the lingering cold. Their efforts, a testament to adaptability and the intimate knowledge of plants and seasons passed down through generations. In these small improvised gardens, every leaf and shoot became a symbol of hope, a tangible result of human perseverance and creativity in the face of adversity. And the communal aspect of this innovation was equally significant. Neighbors shared seeds, compost, and techniques, turning the city's shadowed quarters into networks of productivity, sustenance, and social cohesion, and imbuing otherwise bleak urban spaces with quiet vitality. Children who once only observed the rhythms of nature now participated in experiments, observing the growth of mushrooms, tending seedlings, canning seedlings, and noting how subtle differences in moisture, darkness, or warmth could make the difference between a thriving harvest and complete failure. Learning not only the skills of survival, but the resilience, patience, acuity that would serve them throughout life. Through these adaptive practices, the urban population of Constantinople and countless smaller towns transformed scarcity into opportunity, demonstrating that even when the familiar forces of sun, soil, and season failed, human beings could improvise, innovate, and thrive in new ways, creating a fragile but resilient system that sustained communities, preserved hope, and reminded everyone that life could continue even in the shadow of unrelenting darkness. Where ordinary methods had failed, but extraordinary creativity became the key to endurance and survival. As the months of dim, bluish twilight stretched into one another, the need for resourcefulness became not merely an advantage, but a lifeline, a subtle thread connecting survival, ingenuity, and community in a world where the familiar comforts of abundance had vanished, and where every decision, every action, carried consequences for the fragile ecosystem of a family's or neighborhood's existence. In the cramped quarters of Constantinople's homes and cellars, people quickly learned that sharing limited supplies, whether a handful of dried legumes, a small loaf of bread, or even the precious water carried from distant wells, was essential not just for survival, but for maintaining trust and cohesion among neighbors. For hoarding, even in moments of fear, often led to discord, suspicion, and sometimes tragedy. Parents instructed children in the careful rationing of meals, the weighing of portions, and the judicious use of every scrap, while teaching them that generosity, even in scarcity, could cultivate alliances and goodwill that might one day return a favor in kind, proving that human survival depends as much on relationships as on calories or firewood. Tools, once taken for granted, were repurposed with an almost reverent ingenuity. Broken wooden handles became stakes to support struggling seedlings. Cracked clay pots were transformed into small indoor planters for mushrooms or herbs, and scraps of cloth were woven together to insulate windows, protect delicate crops, or create makeshift coverings for children sleeping in unheated rooms. Every item, no matter how insignificant it might have seemed before the darkness descended, gained new value, and families learned to observe, experiment, and improvise, recognizing patterns of cause and effect, and understanding that adaptation in a world stripped of abundance required both patience and a willingness to see possibility in what others might discard. Even the simplest axe boiling water over a tiny fire to extend its use, mending clothing rather than discarding it, or trading a portion of one family's food for a tool or skill from another, became strategies that could tip the balance between survival and failure. This culture of resourcefulness extended beyond mere physical needs. It became intertwined with the psychological endurance necessary to navigate months of unyielding gloom. For every small victory, every creative solution to a scarcity problem served as a reinforcement of agency, reminding individuals that, even when the sun had seemingly abandoned the sky, they retained the capacity to shape their environment, influence outcomes, and preserve dignity and hope. Communities thrived not because of wealth or centralized aid, but because of collective ingenuity, the cumulative effect of countless small decisions, adjustments, and acts of cooperation, where each person's resourcefulness augmented that of their neighbors, creating a delicate, interdependent system that allowed families to endure the seemingly impossible, turning limitation into ingenuity and scarcity into the crucible from which resilience was forged. In essence, the darkness of 536 CE did more than obscure sunlight and stunt crops. It illuminated the extraordinary capacities of human beings to observe, adapt, and collaborate in ways that transcended mere survival, showing that when conventional means fail, the combination of creativity, careful stewardship, and shared responsibility could sustain life and community in even the most unforgiving conditions. And that true survival was as much a product of ingenuity and moral choice as it was of food, shelter, and warmth. Amid the cold, blue-tinged haze that stretched over cities and countryside alike, a profound unease settled in the hearts of people. For the unnatural darkness could not be explained by ordinary observation or reason, and in the absence of scientific understanding, many turned to the realm of the divine, interpreting the eerie gloom as a sign of celestial displeasure, a punishment for moral failings, or an ominous warning from God or the gods themselves. And in doing so, the social and religious fabric of communities was drawn tightly around fear, ritual, and speculation. Priests and local religious leaders seized the moment as both a call for reflection and an opportunity to guide the masses, preaching that the darkness had descended because humanity had strayed from the righteous path, that impiety, greed, and sinful indulgence had angered the heavens, and that only devotion, confession, and prayer could hope to lift a veil that had transformed day into an endless twilight. Congregations gathered more frequently, candlelight flickering in diamond churches and shrines, echoing with solemn chants and fervent supplications, and the collective anxiety of the crowd often became amplified within the sacred walls, where fear of divine wrath mingled with hope for protection, creating a heightened sense of urgency and purpose that dictated daily behavior, choices, and interactions. At the same time, ordinary families absorbed these teachings and interpretations in deeply personal ways, each member reading omens and frost, crop failure, and sickness, and wondering if their own actions or those of their neighbors had drawn the heavens' ire. Some responded by attempting extraordinary acts of piety, fasting longer than before, donating the little they had to temples, or engaging in public penance, while others sought more practical forms of appeasement, striving to care for the vulnerable in the community, believing that acts of kindness and sacrifice might counterbalance divine disfavor. Even children, though largely unaware of the abstract concepts of morality and divine judgment, absorbed the tension and seriousness of these rituals, watching parents and elders navigate a world where survival and faith were inseparably intertwined, learning early that human behavior was scrutinized not only by neighbors, but, it was believed, by forces beyond comprehension. This interpretation of darkness as divine punishment also shaped social dynamics, influencing leadership decisions, creating tensions between different religious factions, and intensifying the influence of figures who could interpret celestial signs or dictate moral guidance. Markets, streets, and homes were suffused with conversations about sin, virtue, and the proper course of action, and the pervasive sense of uncertainty magnified the importance of communal rituals, processions, and ceremonies, which offered both a psychological anchor and a tangible way for individuals to feel that they were contributing to the restoration of light and order. Yet, amidst the fear and speculation, a quieter, more pragmatic understanding began to emerge among those who had endured long enough, that while divine explanations provided meaning and structure to the chaos, survival still depended on human ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience, and that faith and action, belief and resourcefulness needed to exist side by side if families and communities were to endure the unprecedented darkness that had transformed their world. In the shadow of the endless twilight and the widespread fear that gripped cities, villages, and rural settlements alike, the figure of Emperor Justinian loomed large in the collective consciousness of the Byzantine world, a symbol both of authority and, paradoxically, distance, for, while his decrees and ambitious relief efforts were meant to stabilize the empire and offer aid to those suffering under frost, famine, and darkness, the realities of daily life for ordinary families remained largely beyond the reach of imperial power, creating a complex relationship between ruler and ruled, one shaped by hope, resentment, admiration, and the recognition of human limits. Tales circulated in crowded markets and cramped households of Justinian's grand churches, his carefully staged public appearances, and the edicts he sent to cities and provinces, promising supplies, organizing patrols to protect grain shipments, and attempting to mitigate the worst consequences of the mysterious darkness. Yet, for many, these gestures felt distant, almost symbolic, as the food on the table, the warmth of the hearth, and the health of children depended far more on one's own ingenuity, the support of neighbors, and the ability to improvise in the moment than on the promises of an emperor seated in a palace hundreds of miles away. Families might whisper about the emperor's efforts while huddled around flickering candlelight, noting the disparity between the grand announcements of aid and the slow trickle of tangible benefits that actually reached their neighborhoods. And even as some saw him as a protector or a divine agent acting on humanity's behalf, others quietly resented the reality that political maneuvering, distant administration, and ceremonial authority often had little immediate effect on the frost-stunted crops or the crowded quarters of refugees, and that the burdens of daily survival, finding food, tending makeshift gardens, caring for sick children, and securing shelter fell squarely upon their own shoulders. Yet, even in this tension between distant imperial power and immediate necessity, Justinian's presence shaped perception, governance, and strategy across the empire, setting priorities for relief, mobilizing resources, and reinforcing social order. And his policies became threads within the complex tapestry of human resilience, influencing the distribution of food, the protection of trade routes, and the authorization of communal work initiatives, which allowed families and communities to operate with some sense of structure and predictability amidst the chaos. Ordinary citizens, while skeptical of his immediate effectiveness, understood that the emperor's actions, far removed from the frost-bitten streets they navigated daily, had the potential to amplify or constrain the impact of their own ingenuity, cooperation, and resourcefulness, and thus life in 536 CE assisted in a delicate balance between the reach of imperial power and the agency of local communities. A dynamic where rulers shaped the possibilities, but human determination ultimately dictated survival. In the end, Justinian became both a distant figurehead and a symbol of centralized hope, a reminder that leadership could inspire, coordinate, and enforce, yet could not replace the intimate hands-on efforts required to endure darkness, hunger, and uncertainty, and that, while history often records emperors in grand terms, the true measure of survival in 536 CE rested on the capacity of ordinary people to adapt, collaborate, and innovate every single day. A testament to resilience that no decree, however ambitious, could fully provide, even as communities struggled to survive through frost-stiffened streets, dim twilight, and scarcity of food. The crowded urban centers became tinderboxes for unrest, as fear, hunger, desperation collided with the limitations of local governance, and ordinary citizens found themselves navigating not only the physical challenges of survival, but also the unpredictable dangers that erupted among those around them. Markets, once bustling with trade and conversation, now teetered on the edge of chaos, as shortages of grain and essential goods sparked tension, arguments, and occasionally outright violence, with neighbors turned on one another in moments of panic or frustration, and the air itself seemed charged with a volatile energy that mirrored the unnatural gloom overhead. Fires broke out with alarming frequency, whether from accidental neglect in hastily built stoves, overburdened hearths, or deliberate acts born of fear or protest, and the smoke mingled with the persistent blue haze, adding layers of confusion, panic, and danger that could overwhelm even the most prepared family. Crowds often gathered around these disturbances, drawn by curiosity, fear, or the hope of scavenging whatever they could from the misfortune of others, and the streets became scenes of improvisation and chaos, where families moved cautiously through tight alleyways, children clutched close to parents, and makeshift barricades or protective groups formed spontaneously to shield homes, gardens, and stores from both fire and human aggression. Rumors spread like wildfire, exaggerating the severity of events and fueling suspicion that neighbors might act out of desperation, further heightening the sense of insecurity. And the unpredictable nature of these urban emergencies made each day a delicate negotiation between caution and necessity, where even routine tasks like fetching water or gathering fuel carried an elevated risk. Amid this turbulence, local leaders, militia, and even ordinary citizens found themselves improvising strategies to maintain some semblance of order, organizing watch groups, mediating disputes, and attempting to extinguish small fires before they engulfed entire blocks. Yet these measures were never fully sufficient, as the sheer density of refugees, the strain on resources, and the psychological toll of prolonged darkness ensured that every success was precarious and every calm could be shattered at a moment's notice. Families relied on intuition, quick decision-making, and the protective networks they had forged, moving together through unsafe areas, sharing information about which streets were hazardous, and trusting only those whose loyalty had been proven under duress. For in these conditions, survival required both vigilance and communal solidarity. Despite the fear, confusion, and occasional violence, human resilience persisted as ordinary people adapted to the rhythms of uncertainty, learned to interpret signs of danger in their environment, and developed unspoken codes of conduct for navigating the precarious urban landscape, balancing self-preservation with the ethical demands of cooperation, compassion, and protection of the vulnerable. The chaos, in a way, revealed both the fragility and the strength of human society. While order could collapse quickly under pressure, it could also be rebuilt, reinforced, and sustained through ingenuity, courage, and the small but deliberate acts that allow families to endure yet another day of darkness, frost, and uncertainty. Amid the turmoil of crowded streets, fires that licked the edges of fragile homes, and the unpredictable violence that seemed to surge from the very shadows themselves, parents were forced to make decisions that would test the limits of their courage, love, and ingenuity, as the imperative to protect their children became an overriding force that often demanded unimaginable sacrifice, careful calculation, and a willingness to place the youngest and most vulnerable at the center of every strategy for survival, even if it meant separation from those they cherished most. Families huddled together in the dim, flickering light of candlelit rooms, whispering urgently about escape routes, hidden passageways, and the safest paths to carry children through streets teeming with desperate adults and opportunistic thieves, knowing that every step carried both potential salvation and imminent danger, and that hesitation could be fatal. In many cases, parents made the heart-wrenching choice to send their children ahead to safer regions, ports, or fortified urban centers, entrusting them to neighbors, distant relatives, or even strangers whose loyalty had been tested under shared adversity, all while remaining behind to confront threats that they could not fully control, whether that was securing enough food for the journey, negotiating passage, or confronting looters and marauders who had begun to exploit the chaos with ruthless efficiency. Each farewell was accompanied by a mixture of anxiety, hope, and quiet determination. As parents impressed upon their children the rules for survival, the signs of danger to watch for, and the importance of trust, courage, and discretion, embedding lessons that were as much moral and psychological as they were practical. For even a child's instinctive resilience could be a fragile thread that needed guidance and reinforcement to ensure their passage through the darkness unbroken. The act of sending children away, while emotionally devastating, also revealed the extraordinary capacity of human beings to prioritize long-term survival over immediate comfort, and to act with foresight even when confronted with uncertainty, fear, and profound grief. Parents who remained behind faced challenges of equal weight, navigating the treacherous urban environment, maintaining food supplies, securing shelter, and protecting themselves and the elderly or infirm. all while carrying the emotional burden of knowing their children's safety depended on others, and that every misstep, every unforeseen threat could undo weeks or months of careful planning. Yet, within these painful separations, bonds were strengthened in a paradoxical way. Trust, reliance, and communal responsibility deepened, and the shared knowledge that survival often demanded sacrifice became a defining principle for families and neighborhoods alike. Even in the darkest hours, the instinct to protect and preserve the next generation shaped behavior, decisions, and social dynamics, creating networks of guardianship, mentorship, and mutual oversight, where the welfare of children became the metric by which courage, loyalty, and humanity were measured. And were the most harrowing choices, sending them away, exposing oneself to danger, or sharing precious food, were acts of love and strategy intertwined, demonstrating that in times of profound crisis, parental devotion could be as much a tool of survival as ingenuity, resourcefulness, or communal solidarity, and that even in the face of pervasive darkness and human fragility, hope could be carried forward in the small hands of children navigating paths toward safety. After nearly a year and a half of pervasive gloom, frost that lingered far beyond its season, and the constant gnawing anxiety that had become the rhythm of everyday life, a subtle but profound shift began to ripple through the landscapes of Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia as the mysterious haze that had veiled the sun finally started to thin, allowing the first tentative rays of sunlight to pierce the long-dimmed skies, spilling over fields, rooftops, and city streets with a warmth that had seemed almost unimaginable during the darkest months. At first, these golden glimmers were fleeting, the blue twilight occasionally reclaiming its hold. Yet, even these brief moments of illumination carried immense psychological power, signaling that the long nightmare was easing, that nature had begun to reassert itself, and that the cycles of life so cruelly suspended were once again inching toward renewal. Families who had endured months of frostbitten mornings and stunted, failing crops now found the earth slowly responding to the light. The stubborn soil that had refused to yield even the hardiest plants began to soften. Seeds buried in desperation or ingenuity sprouted, and the first shoots of green, tentative yet vibrant, pushed upward through the muted brown, a living testament to resilience and the enduring rhythm of the natural world. Communities across cities and villages alike felt a collective exhale, a surge of hope intertwined with cautious optimism. As households once reliant on rationed food, scavenging, and mutual aid observed small miracles of renewal, a few stalks of wheat reaching toward the sun, mushrooms flourishing in cellars or shaded plots, in rivers and wells slowly reflecting the light more clearly, signaling that water, warmth, and sustenance were returning to a world long constrained by scarcity and fear. Children who had been shielded, sent away, or carefully guided through treacherous streets now glimpsed open skies once more. Their laughter tentative at first, but growing bolder with each day, filling the streets with sound that had been absent for months, while parents who had carried the weight of impossible decisions, separation, and vigilance felt a rare sense of relief. The knowledge that the worst of their trials had passed. Those scars of loss, hunger, and anxiety remained, quietly etched into their expressions, bodies, and the rhythms of daily life. Even as light returned and crops slowly recovered, the lessons of survival endured. Families maintained the practices of careful resource management, communal support, and adaptive ingenuity that had been forged during the long darkness, recognizing that the return of sunlight did not erase the vulnerabilities exposed by the crisis, but rather offered an opportunity to apply hard-earned skills and wisdom toward rebuilding, strengthening communities, and preparing for the uncertainties of the future. The gradual restoration of agriculture, combined with improved weather and a cautious reopening of trade and market systems, allowed households to regain some measure of stability and nutrition, turning malnutrition and fear into renewed energy, cooperation, and the ability to plan beyond mere day-to-day survival. In villages, cities, and farms, people began to emerge from shelters and cellars, tending the newly thriving fields, repairing buildings, and reconnecting with neighbors, friends, and relatives from whom they had been separated, while simultaneously cultivating hope that the patterns of scarcity, violence, and uncertainty that had defined the previous months were slowly fading into memory. The return of sunlight was not just a physical restoration. It was a psychological and spiritual renewal, a vivid reminder of the endurance of life, the capacity of human communities to adapt, and the enduring truth that even in the darkest times, perseverance, ingenuity, and cooperation could ultimately prevail, transforming despair into cautious optimism, fear into planning, and survival into a tangible promise of continuity, growth, and hope. As the long twilight finally began to retreat and the sun reclaimed its place in the sky, communities across the affected regions embarked on the painstaking and deeply human process of rebuilding, a slow and deliberate act that blended physical labor, emotional repair, and the rekindling of social bonds that had been strained, fractured, or temporarily severed during the dark months of 536 and 537 CE. And in doing so, ordinary people demonstrated a resilience that was both practical and profoundly inspiring, for survival had been just the beginning. Now came the task of restoring a sense of order, purpose, and continuity in a world that had been suspended in uncertainty for far too long. Families returned to their farms, inspecting fields that had lain fallow or been overrun by frost, carefully clearing debris, tilling soil that had hardened under months of neglect, and planting seeds with the hope that the renewed sunlight and milder weather would allow crops to flourish, while simultaneously rediscovering the rhythms of daily life, milking goats, tending chickens, mending tools, repairing roofs, and gathering water with the precision and discipline learned during the harshest days of scarcity, all of which reinforced the knowledge that survival required both physical effort and unwavering consistency. In villages and small towns, neighbors who had been temporarily scattered by the chaos now reunited, forming networks of mutual support that combined the practical with the social, as families shared tools, labor, and knowledge, while also celebrating the simple joys of community children playing in streets once again. Markets beginning to hum with trade, and the smell of bread and firewood filling the air, reminders that life could, with effort and cooperation, reclaim some semblance of normalcy. These acts of rebuilding were not merely about survival or sustenance. They were a reaffirmation of identity, culture, and agency, for in repairing homes, replanting fields, and tending livestock, individuals asserted the continuity of their lives, their traditions, and their communities, refusing to allow the darkness of the past months to define them entirely, and signaling to the next generation that adversity could be endured and overcome through perseverance, ingenuity, and shared responsibility. Even in the larger urban centers, where the memory of riots, fires, and scarcity had left deep psychological and structural scars, people worked tirelessly to restore order and stability, repairing roads, clearing marketplaces, resuming trade, and establishing public systems to ensure that essential goods, especially grain and water, reached the most vulnerable. A collaborative effort that depended not only on local authorities, but on the networks of ordinary citizens who had survived through mutual aid, improvisation, and vigilance. Slowly, daily routines emerged from the shadow of crisis. Children returned to informal lessons or apprenticeships. Families once again prepared meals with a sense of abundance rather than rationed necessity. And festivals or religious ceremonies resumed with renewed gratitude and purpose, celebrating the simple but profound truth that life could continue, that the rhythms of work, recreation, and ritual could coexist, and that the community's collective efforts had restored a fragile but precious equilibrium. Through these efforts, people discovered that rebuilding was as much about psychology as infrastructure. The act of planting a single row of wheat, repairing a broken fence, or lighting a fire for the first time in weeks became an assertion of hope, agency, and human dignity. A tangible declaration that while the darkness had tested their bodies, spirits, and relationships, it could not extinguish the capacity for renewal, cooperation, and resilience that defined human communities. And that through persistent effort, shared knowledge, and mutual care, life, fragile yet enduring, could reestablish itself in both practical and profoundly meaningful ways. Amid the slow and painstaking process of rebuilding farms, homes, and social networks, the children who had lived through the long darkness emerged not only as survivors, but as remarkable embodiments of resilience, adaptation, and the innate human capacity to learn under pressure. And among them, figures like Marcus, whose story threads through the fabric of this historical crisis, demonstrated how even the youngest members of society could absorb responsibility, develop practical skills, can contribute meaningfully to the survival and recovery of their families and communities, transforming what might have seemed like vulnerability into unexpected strength. From the earliest days of returning to farm life, Marcus learned to interpret the subtle signs of plant growth, recognize which crops were viable and which had succumbed to frost, and mastered the careful balance between feeding livestock and rationing what little remained for human consumption, all while maintaining a sharp awareness of safety in environments that could still harbor hidden dangers, whether in the forest, the village streets, or the crowded urban markets that had become focal points for resource distribution and communal tension. Under the guidance of parents, elders, and experienced neighbors, Marcus and other children became integral participants in daily life, taking on responsibilities that might have been unimaginable in a more peaceful and predictable world. Yet, in this extraordinary context, their contributions were vital. They assisted in planting and tending crops, repaired tools, carried water and firewood, and even helped care for younger siblings or livestock, demonstrating both initiative and an ability to learn through observation and experimentation, often improvising solutions when conventional knowledge or adult guidance fell short. Beyond practical skills, these children absorbed lessons in leadership, cooperation, and empathy, developing the social intelligence necessary to navigate networks of mutual support that had become critical to survival. And in doing so, they experienced accelerated growth, not merely in years, but in maturity, judgment, and self-confidence, learning to balance obedience with initiative, caution with courage, and curiosity with vigilance. Marcus, in particular, exemplified the extraordinary adaptability of young minds in times of crisis, as he not only mastered the physical tasks of farming and domestic labor, but also learned to mentor other children, share knowledge of crop care or foraging, and participate in group problem solving, turning what might have been despair into active engagement with the environment and the community. His resilience was mirrored in countless other children whose days had been punctuated by fear, uncertainty, enforced separations from family, and who now found purpose and empowerment in the restoration of routines, the revival of school-like instruction, and the small but meaningful victories of planting a thriving patch of vegetables or successfully tending a sick animal. Through the experiences of Marcus and his peers, it becomes clear that the next generation, though vulnerable in body and experience, possessed an extraordinary capacity to internalize lessons of adaptation, resilience, and resourcefulness, learning not only to survive, but to thrive, to assume responsibility, and to act as a stabilizing force within their families and communities, ensuring that the knowledge, skills, and strategies born of the crisis were preserved, passed on, and expanded upon, and that the future, though uncertain, was now guided by a cohort of young people whose courage, adaptability, and ingenuity would shape the recovery and resilience of society in ways both immediate and enduring. Even after the sun had gradually reclaimed the sky and crops had begun to grow once more, the long shadow cast by those 18 months of unrelenting darkness continued to shape human lives in profound and lasting ways. As families, communities, and entire regions grappled not only with the physical toll of frost, hunger, and disease, but also with the deep social, economic, and psychological repercussions that lingered long after the immediate crisis had passed. Villages that had survived intact found themselves reshaped, with populations reduced by starvation, migration, or plague, and with altered social hierarchies as families and individuals who had displayed extraordinary courage, ingenuity, or resourcefulness earned new influence and authority, while others, weakened or traumatized by the relentless uncertainty, faced long-term marginalization or dependence on community support networks. Markets and trade networks, once familiar and reliable, had been disrupted by the combination of failed harvests, transportation difficulties, and the instability of urban centers, creating a ripple effect that slowed economic recovery, altered patterns of production and consumption, and forced both rulers and commoners to innovate or adapt to survive in a landscape now marked by scarcity, caution, and shifting opportunity. Psychologically, the darkness imprinted itself on the collective consciousness, fostering a heightened awareness of vulnerability, an enduring fear of sudden disaster, and a deep appreciation for the fragility of everyday life, lessons that influenced behavior, decision-making, and cultural practices for years to come. Families who had sent children away to ensure survival, adults who had witnessed violence or social breakdown, and children like Marcus who had assumed responsibilities far beyond their years. All carried a blend of trauma and resilience into the future, shaping not only their own choices, but also the social norms, communal bonds, and coping strategies of subsequent generations. Rituals of gratitude, cautionary tales of moral and spiritual failure, and even practical approaches to agriculture and resource management were reshaped in response to the memory of scarcity, frost, and uncertainty, creating a legacy that intertwined survival with cultural identity, belief, and social cohesion. At the regional and imperial level, rulers such as Emperor Justinian faced the dual challenge of restoring order and legitimacy while managing the ongoing consequences of disrupted economies, population loss, and the lingering effects of famine and disease, illustrating the delicate balance between authority and human need, between centralized ambition and the realities of daily life for ordinary people, and the ways in which even brief environmental catastrophes could reverberate through political, social, and economic structures for decades. Yet, amid these challenges, the adaptive strategies, cooperative behaviors, and resourcefulness forged during the darkness persisted as a blueprint for resilience. Communities had learned to organize collectively, share knowledge and resources, anticipate threats, and rely on both social and practical ingenuity to weather crises, ensuring that the memory of the darkness would become not only a cautionary tale of human vulnerability, but also a testament to endurance, innovation, and the remarkable capacity of societies to recover and rebuild. In short, the 18 months of dimmed skies and frozen fields left an indelible mark on human history, reshaping communities, economies, governance, and individual psychology. And while life eventually resumed, the lessons learned about cooperation, adaptation, vigilance, and hope in the face of relentless adversity remained, echoing through generations and reminding humanity that even in the most extraordinary darkness, survival, ingenuity, and resilience could illuminate a path forward. The darkness that had swept across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia did not exist in isolation. It was intertwined with a series of extraordinary historical events that would forever shape the trajectory of human societies. None more devastating than the plague of Justinian, which emerged as the sun's return signaled not only the possibility of renewal, but also the frightening resurgence of disease, spreading rapidly across trade routes and urban centers, claiming lives with shocking swiftness, and compounding the suffering already wrought by famine, frost, and social disruption, such that the memory of these 18 months was inseparable from a broader narrative of catastrophe, political instability, and the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's formidable power. As the Byzantine Empire grappled with the logistical and moral challenges of responding to both famine and plague, Emperor Justinian himself was thrust into a position of extraordinary responsibility, attempting to marshal resources, stabilize the economy, and reinforce his authority through the construction of grand public works, churches, and legal reforms. While the ordinary citizens who had endured starvation, fear, and the uncertainty of darkness witnessed firsthand the tension between centralized power and the immediate, tangible needs of survival, often perceiving their rulers as simultaneously distant and essential, protective, yet removed from the daily realities of human suffering. Political upheavals further complicated this period. As regional governors, city officials, local leaders navigated the precarious intersection of scarcity, disease, and social unrest, making decisions that could spell life or death for entire communities, while citizens, ready stretched thin by failed harvests and dimmed skies, responded in unpredictable ways, ranging from cooperative solidarity to acts of desperation that sometimes erupted into riots, fires, or other forms of urban chaos, illustrating how environmental crises, epidemics, and political uncertainty were inextricably linked, reinforcing each other in cycles that tested the moral, practical, and social fabric of societies across continents. Families like those we have followed, children like Marcus, and communities across both rural and urban landscapes found themselves navigating not only the physical consequences of darkness, frost, and hunger, but also the intangible, far-reaching effects of empire, governance, and human ambition, where the interplay of power and vulnerability, of policy and daily survival, shaped every decision, every risk, and every act of ingenuity or cooperation. In this context, the events of 536 and the following years emerge not as isolated anomalies, but as a lens through which to understand the complex entanglement of environmental catastrophe, epidemiological crisis, and political dynamics, revealing how a sudden disruption in sunlight could cascade into economic instability, societal stress, and the reshaping of human communities, and how the capacity to endure such pressures depended not solely on individual skill or resilience, but on the networks of cooperation, shared knowledge, an adaptive strategy that had been forged under the harshest imaginable conditions, creating lessons that reverberated far beyond the immediate horizon, influencing policies, practices, and social expectations for generations to come. Through this interplay of darkness, disease, and political upheaval, one can see the profound truth that human history is rarely shaped by a single factor. Rather, it is the cumulative effect of intertwined crises, the ebb and flow of power, and the capacity of ordinary people to respond with ingenuity, solidarity, and hope that determines which societies endure, which adapt, and which falter under the weight of extraordinary circumstances, offering a sobering yet ultimately inspiring testament to the resilience of humanity even in the shadow of overwhelming adversity. Over time, the extraordinary events of 536 CE, the prolonged darkness, the frost-killed crops, the waves of famine and disease, and the turbulence in both urban and rural centers, began to take on a life beyond the strictly historical, becoming mythologized in ways that transformed them from immediate crises into enduring, cautionary tales about the fragility of human existence in the face of forces far greater than ourselves, and how quickly the familiar rhythms of life can unravel when sunlight is dimmed. Harvests fail, and the structures of society falter. Chroniclers, storytellers, and later generations look back on these months of eerie twilight and human struggle, interpreting them through lenses of divine will, moral lesson, and cosmic warning, framing the darkness not merely as a sequence of unfortunate events, but as a tangible manifestation of the vulnerabilities inherent in human society, vulnerabilities that could be exposed by environmental catastrophe, disease, or social disorder, and that demanded reflection, humility, and an awareness of the limits of human control over the natural world. The story of 536 CE became a moral and cultural touchstone, a narrative that blended historical fact with allegorical meaning, illustrating how quickly life could shift from security to precarity, and how even the most resilient communities and individuals could be tested by a convergence of natural and societal crises. In villages, cities, and courts alike, people would recount tales of frost in spring, of children like Marcus stepping into responsibilities far beyond their years, of families navigating famine and plague with ingenuity and courage, and of rulers striving to maintain order while ordinary people bore the brunt of hardship. And in doing so, these stories reinforced collective memory about the fragility of food systems, the unpredictability of climate, and the importance of mutual aid and adaptability when conventional structures faltered, by framing these experiences as myth and lesson rather than solely as a historical record. Societies created a narrative that extended beyond the immediate generation, embedding the events of 536 into cultural consciousness as a symbol of human vulnerability and resilience, a reminder that prosperity and security are never guaranteed, that cooperation and foresight are indispensable, and that human ingenuity, courage, and solidarity remain the most potent defenses against calamity. Even centuries later, the lessons of that eerie, sunless year continue to resonate, illustrating how environmental crises, political upheaval, and societal stress are not abstract phenomena, but lived realities with profound consequences, and how the memory of survival, adaptation, and mutual care can inform both storytelling and practical decision-making for generations to come. In the end, the mythologization of 536 CE is not merely a tale of despair, but a story of endurance and reflection, a timeless lesson in humility, preparedness, and the power of human communities to navigate extraordinary adversity, reminding us that while the forces of nature and history may be unpredictable and often unforgiving, it's the responses of people, their resilience, innovation, and capacity for cooperation can shape not only immediate survival, but the cultural memory and moral frameworks that guide future generations through crises yet to come. Looking back on the extraordinary events of 536 CE, becomes strikingly clear that the darkest year in human memory was not only a tale of environmental catastrophe and societal upheaval, but also a vivid demonstration of what it truly means to survive when the familiar certainties of daily life are stripped away, leaving people exposed to the whims of weather, the fragility of food systems, and the unpredictability of human behavior. Survival in this period depended less on individual strength alone than on the collective capacity to adapt, to learn rapidly from circumstance, and to forge networks of mutual support that could compensate for the failures of conventional systems and the absence of reliable authority. Families, like those we have followed, discovered that endurance was rooted in both the tangible and intangible, in cultivating food in unconventional ways when sunlight failed, in sharing scarce provisions without hesitation, in improvising tools and methods to meet needs that had never before arisen, and in maintaining hope and purpose in the faces of fear and uncertainty, demonstrating that adaptability is not merely a skill, but a lifeline woven into every decision and every action during the long months of twilight. Equally essential was the role of community. As the frost-claimed fields and famine stalked villages, it became evident that no family could survive in isolation. Children, elders, farmers, and urban workers alike had to rely on one another, forming informal networks of care, trust, and labor sharing that allowed tasks to be completed, food to be distributed, and knowledge to be preserved. Those networks were not always perfect, and not every choice led to success. Yet they exemplified a fundamental truth about human resilience. When individuals pooled their resources, combine their strengths, and make sacrifices for the greater good, their collective capacity to endure far exceeds what any one person could achieve alone. Marcus and other children in these communities, thrust into responsibilities well beyond their years, embodied this principle as they learned to navigate danger, assist in labor, and contribute meaningfully to the survival of both family and neighborhoods, demonstrating that resilience is as much a social phenomenon as it is an individual attribute. Finally, the experience of 536 CE teaches that resilience requires a balance between prudence and creativity, between caution and action, between the patience to endure uncertainty and the courage to innovate. The survivors of the darkness did not simply wait for the sun to return. They acted, experimented, adapted, and learned from every failure and success. Whether discovering the viability of mushroom cultivation indoors, repurposing tools to solve unforeseen problems, or forming alliances to protect children and vulnerable community members, every act of ingenuity reinforced the lesson that enduring a prolonged crisis demands both flexibility and determination, a willingness to embrace change while preserving core values and social bonds. Ultimately, the darkest year in history is more than a chronicle of hardship. It is a timeless illustration of the principles that enable humans to endure the unpredictable forces of nature and society: adaptability to rapidly changing circumstances, reliance on and contribution to communal networks, and the cultivation of resilience that allows hope and action to persist even when the world seems irreparably altered. These lessons, drawn from both historical record and the lived experiences of families navigating the twilight, serve as a powerful reminder that survival is never the product of chance alone, but of knowledge, collaboration, and the unyielding human spirit determined to rise, rebuild, and persevere against the harshest of odds. Even as the eerie blue haze slowly lifted and sunlight began to touch the fields once more, bringing with it the promise of thawing earth and the first tentative shoots of crops that had somehow survived the frost, the memories of those 18 months remained etched deeply into the minds, hearts, and daily practices of the people who had endured them, serving as enduring reminders that even the most extreme hardships, no matter how relentless or terrifying at the time, are ultimately temporal. Yet their lessons resonate far beyond the immediate crisis, shaping future behavior, decision-making, and priorities in ways that persist for generations. The villagers and city dwellers who had learned to navigate prolonged darkness did not simply return to life as it had been. They carried forward a heightened awareness of nature's unpredictability, an appreciation for the importance of preparedness, and a deep respect for the interdependence of community that allowed them to survive when survival seemed impossible. The experience had honed their ingenuity, teaching them to improvise solutions in the absence of standard tools or resources, to adapt agricultural methods when sunlight was scarce, and to repurpose whatever they could find to meet critical needs. Embedding a practical knowledge that would influence everything from food storage practices to urban planning, trade, logistics, and even family routines for decades to come. Children like Marcus, whose formative years had been marked by both fear and responsibility, emerged not merely as survivors, but as individuals, transformed by the crucible of adversity. Their resilience, problem-solving skills, and social awareness permanently shaped by the experiences of caring for younger children, assisting in food production, and navigating social and political complexities that even adults found challenging. In parallel, parents, neighbors, and local leaders recalibrated their priorities, often placing community welfare, shared resources, and long-term sustainability above individual convenience or short-term gain, recognizing that the preservation of life and the ability to adapt to unpredictable crises demanded foresight, cooperation, and a willingness to make sacrifices that would ripple forward into the future. Moreover, the psychological imprint of 536 CE left societies more attuned to both opportunity and risk. As families remembered vividly the fragility of stability and the suddenness with which it could be disrupted by environmental, social, or political upheaval, festivals, religious observances, agricultural rituals, and local governance all reflected a cautious optimism tempered by experience, balancing celebration of survival with sober recognition of human vulnerability, embedding a sense of humility and vigilance that shaped cultural narratives, ethical considerations, and even political expectations for decades. The darkness, famine, and plague were no longer just historical events. They became touchstones of memory, myth, and practical wisdom, reminding communities that while hardship may eventually pass, its lessons endure, guiding future choices, fostering resilience, and strengthening the bonds between people who had witnessed firsthand the thin line between abundance and deprivation, hope and despair, life and loss. In essence, the extreme hardships of 536 CE passed in time, but the human response to them through ingenuity, adaptation, collaboration, and the hard-earned wisdom that arose from both suffering and survival left a permanent imprint on generations, demonstrating that crises, though transient, have the power to transform knowledge, behavior, and priorities in ways that resonate far beyond their immediate temporal boundaries, ultimately revealing the remarkable capacity of people to endure, learn, and prepare for the uncertainties that lie ahead. As we look back across the centuries to the year 536 CE, it becomes clear that the shadows that fell across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia were more than just a physical phenomenon. They were a profound metaphor for human vulnerability, a stark reminder that life as we know it can shift in an instant when forces beyond our control intervene. For 18 months, a mysterious fog cloaked the land, dimming the sunlight to a ghostly blue and transforming ordinary days into a perpetual twilight that challenged every aspect of survival. People awoke to uncertainty each morning, their routines disrupted, their expectations upended, and their understanding of the world called into question. The cause of this prolonged darkness remained unknown, a terrifying mystery that left communities confused, fearful, and desperate, struggling to make sense of an environment that no longer followed the familiar rhythms of sun and season. Families, once secure in their homes and fields, now faced a relentless cold that was neither winter nor spring, watched as crops withered and frost claimed the earth, and felt the gnawing hunger that accompanied dwindling food stores, malnutrition, and the gradual loss of weight and strength that marked the very real human toll of this extraordinary climate anomaly. In the face of such adversity, communities began to shift, migrating toward urban centers like Constantinople in search of safety, sustenance, and the possibility of relief. These cities, however, were not sanctuaries so much as pressure cookers of uncertainty, where refugees crowded narrow streets, lived under constant threat of disease, fire, and civil unrest, and had to navigate a landscape of scarcity and limited opportunity. Even the simplest labor became a lifeline, providing bread, cheese, or the occasional fish to stave off starvation, while social networks, familial, neighborly, and communally, merged as the essential scaffolding of survival. People learned quickly that ingenuity and cooperation were not optional but vital. Mushrooms were cultivated indoors when sunlight failed. Tools were repurposed for tasks never imagined, and limited supplies were shared so that no one went completely without. These acts of adaptation and resourcefulness were the quiet heroism of ordinary life, proving that resilience is forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of hardship. Amid the practicalities of survival, society wrestled with interpretation and meaning. Some saw the darkness as divine punishment, a reflection of moral failings or spiritual shortcomings, while rulers like Emperor Justinian were perceived both as distant authorities and as the few who might marshal resources to alleviate suffering. Their presence felt in grand architectural projects and edicts, yet largely removed from the everyday struggles of those enduring the dim months. Chaos was never far away. Urban centers erupted in occasional riots, fires, and disorder, adding danger to desperation. Parents made unimaginable choices, sending children to safety while facing threats themselves, prioritizing the next generation even at the cost of personal security. And yet, through these trials, families persisted, communities adapted, and even children, like Marcus, rose to the occasion, learning skills, taking on responsibilities, and demonstrating the remarkable capacity of youth to endure and grow in the most trying circumstances. Eventually, after roughly 18 months, the haze began to lift. The sun returned, weak at first, then brighter with each passing day, bringing with it the slow but steady recovery of crops, the restoration of farms, and the tentative return to normal activities. Communities rebuilt, relying on the lessons learned during the darkness to stabilize their livelihoods, improve cooperation, and strengthen bonds of mutual support that had carried them through months of fear and deprivation. The experiences of 536 CE left lasting imprints socially, economically, psychologically, shaping behavior, knowledge, and priorities for years to come, reminding generations that even the most extreme hardships are temporary, but the lessons they impart endure. The period became mythologized as a warning about the precariousness of human life in the face of environmental upheaval, disease, and societal stress. A story retold not merely as history, but as a moral and practical guide for navigating uncertainty, emphasizing the importance of adaptability, community, and resilience. In reflecting on 536 CE, one sees that survival is never guaranteed, that ordinary people can rise to extraordinary challenges, and that even when the world seems shrouded in darkness, the human spirit, guided by creativity, cooperation, and hope, has the power to endure, rebuild, and thrive. These lessons, drawn from both history and the intimate stories of families navigating twilight, offer timeless insight. Life is fragile, yet our capacity to adapt, support one another, and persist is far stronger than we often realize. So, as you prepare to rest tonight, take a moment to appreciate the resilience, ingenuity, and courage of those who came before. And remember that no darkness, no matter how prolonged, lasts forever. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with light.